The train's whistle cut through the crisp morning air of Millbrook, Colorado, as it pulled into the weathered station with a familiar grinding of steel wheels against iron rails. Sarah Catherine Walsh pressed her gloved hand against the cool window glass, her heart hammering a rhythm of hope and terror that had kept her sleepless for the past 4 nights of travel from Philadelphia. Through the dust-streaked glass, she could see the modest frontier town sprawling before her like something from the illustrated magazines she'd read back east. False-fronted buildings lined a wide main street, their wooden facades painted in cheerful colors that seemed to defy the harsh mountain environment. Beyond the town, rolling hills stretched towards snow-capped peaks that pierced a sky so blue and vast it made her breath catch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. After 18 months of correspondence with Thomas Mitchell, she was finally here. Finally about to meet the man who had written such thoughtful letters about his cattle ranch, about needing a woman of strong character and gentle nature to share the challenges and rewards of frontier life. His letters had spoken of loneliness in the vast Colorado wilderness, of dreams for a family that would fill his ranch house with laughter and purpose. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the small leather journal tucked in her traveling bag, where she had carefully preserved every letter Thomas had sent. His handwriting was bold and confident, his words painting pictures of a life she had dared to hope might be possible for someone like her. He had asked for a photograph, which she had provided, a carefully composed portrait that showed her best features, intelligent brown eyes, glossy chestnut hair arranged in fashionable waves, and the modest but becoming dress her sister had helped her select. What he didn't know, what she had been unable to bring herself to write in any of her own letters, was the devastating truth that had ended her engagement to Robert Aldridge 3 years ago, the painful revelation that had sent her fleeing from Philadelphia society and into the uncertain arms of a mail-order marriage arrangement. Sarah Catherine Walsh was barren, unable to bear children, a woman whose worth, in the eyes of most men, was fundamentally compromised by this biological failing. The train lurched to a final stop, and Sarah gathered her courage along with her belongings. She wore her finest traveling dress, a deep forest green wool that complemented her coloring and suggested prosperity without ostentation. Her chestnut hair was arranged in a practical but elegant style beneath a small feathered hat, and she carried herself with the poise learned from years in Philadelphia's better social circles. The conductor, a kindly man with silver whiskers, who had shown her particular courtesy during the long journey from Pennsylvania, appeared at her seat with a concerned expression. "Miss Walsh, we've arrived in Millbrook. Are you certain someone will be meeting you?" "Yes, thank you, Mr. Henderson. Mr. Mitchell should be waiting on the platform." Sarah's voice was steady, betraying none of the anxiety that churned in her stomach. She had committed everything to this venture, used the last of her small inheritance to travel west, burned bridges with her family who considered her decision scandalous, and staked her entire future on the hope that Thomas Mitchell would prove to be the honorable man his letters suggested. As she made her way down the narrow aisle, Sarah caught glimpses of herself in the train car's small mirrors. At 26, she was still considered attractive by conventional standards. Her face had character and intelligence, her figure was pleasing, and her manner suggested good breeding and education. But she also knew that in the harsh mathematics of frontier life, a woman's primary value was often measured by her ability to produce children, to ensure the continuation of family lines, and provide labor for demanding ranches and farms. The platform was bustling with activity as passengers disembarked and townspeople gathered to collect mail and packages. Sarah stepped carefully down from the train car, her heart racing as she scanned the crowd for a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark hair and kind eyes, the description Thomas had provided in his letters. There, standing near the station house, was a figure that matched his description perfectly. Well-dressed in a brown suit and black string tie, with the confident bearing of a successful rancher. Thomas Mitchell looked exactly as Sarah had imagined him from his photograph and written descriptions. Handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and an air of competence that spoke of a man who could thrive in frontier conditions. Sarah took a deep breath, smoothed her traveling dress, and began walking across the platform toward her intended husband. Each step felt momentous, carrying her toward a future that could provide everything she had lost: security, purpose, and perhaps even the family she had always dreamed of, even if she could never bear children of her own. The morning sun caught the reddish highlights in her chestnut hair as she approached, and she held her head high despite the curious glances from other travelers and townspeople. Thomas Mitchell looked up as she drew near, his brown eyes taking in her face with an expression that began as pleased surprise. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her racing pulse. "I'm Sarah Catherine Walsh." For a moment, Thomas Mitchell's expression remained welcoming, even warm. He removed his hat and offered a slight bow that spoke to good manners and respect for her Eastern breeding. But as they stood there on the platform, something in his demeanor began to shift. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, or some subtle quality in her voice, or simply the reality of meeting face to face after months of correspondence. "Miss Walsh," he replied, his voice cordial, but carrying an undertone she couldn't quite identify. "Welcome to Millbrook. I trust your journey was comfortable?" "Quite comfortable, thank you. Your descriptions of Colorado were most accurate. It's even more beautiful than I imagined." They stood there for a moment, two strangers who had shared intimate thoughts and dreams through letters, but were now confronting the reality of building a life together. Sarah could sense Thomas taking her measure, evaluating whether the woman before him matched the expectations he had formed through their correspondence. "I've arranged rooms for you at the Millbrook Hotel," Thomas said, gesturing toward a substantial two-story building across the main street. "I thought you might want to rest and refresh yourself before we discuss our arrangements." The word arrangements carried a weight that made Sarah's heart sink slightly. In his letters, Thomas had written about their future together with warmth and certainty. Now, standing before her, he seemed more cautious, more calculating. As they walked toward the hotel, Thomas maintained polite conversation about her journey, the weather, and the town's features. But Sarah could feel him studying her, assessing her in ways that made her increasingly uncomfortable. She began to suspect that this meeting was as much an evaluation as a reunion. The Millbrook Hotel was modest but clean, with a front porch that offered views of Main Street and a lobby furnished with sturdy chairs and tables that suggested frontier practicality over Eastern elegance. Thomas arranged for Sarah's trunk to be delivered to her room and paid for her accommodation with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man accustomed to handling business transactions. "Perhaps we could have dinner this evening," Thomas suggested, as they stood in the hotel lobby. "There are matters we should discuss regarding our future arrangements." Again, that word, arrangements. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Of course, Mr. Mitchell. I look forward to our conversation." As Thomas took his leave, promising to return at 6 o'clock for dinner, Sarah climbed the stairs to her hotel room with growing unease. Something in his manner had changed from the warmth she had expected based on their letters. She sensed that her journey to Colorado might not end with the wedding she had anticipated. Her room was small but comfortable, with a window that offered views of the surrounding mountains and a washstand where she could refresh herself after the long journey. Sarah unpacked her few belongings and tried to shake off the feeling that Thomas Mitchell was having second thoughts about their arrangement. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah prepared for what she increasingly suspected would be a difficult conversation. She changed into her best dress, arranged her hair carefully, and tried to project confidence despite her growing anxiety. Whatever Thomas Mitchell's concerns might be, she was determined to face them with dignity and honest communication. The dining room of the Millbrook Hotel was modest but respectable, with white tablecloths and oil lamps that created a warm atmosphere. Against the gathering dusk, Thomas arrived precisely at 6 o'clock, dressed in a dark suit that emphasized his solid, reliable appearance. But Sarah noticed that his earlier warmth had been replaced by something more businesslike, more distant. They ordered their meals, beef stew and fresh bread that spoke to the practical nature of frontier cuisine, and made polite conversation about the town, the surrounding ranches, and Sarah's impressions of Colorado. But she could sense that Thomas was working up to something, gathering courage for a conversation he found difficult. Finally, as their plates were cleared away, Thomas cleared his throat and fixed Sarah with a direct gaze that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. "Miss Walsh, I believe we should discuss the practical aspects of our arrangement with complete honesty." "Of course, Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate directness." Thomas leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering to ensure privacy in the busy dining room. "In my letters, I expressed my desire for a wife who could help me build a proper family. Children are essential to ranch life, Miss Walsh, for the work they provide, for the continuation of family lines, and for the purpose they give to marriage itself." Sarah felt her heart begin to race, sensing where this conversation was heading. "Understand your perspective completely, Mr. Mitchell. Do you?" Thomas's brown eyes searched her face intently. "Because I've been observing you since your arrival, and something about your manner suggests there may be complications you haven't shared with me." The moment Sarah had dreaded for months had arrived. She could deflect, she could lie, she could try to postpone this revelation until after they were married. But looking into Thomas Mitchell's honest face, she knew that deception would only make the eventual truth more devastating. "Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "there is something I must tell you about my circumstances. Something that I should have shared in my letters but found too difficult to put into words." Thomas's expression grew more serious, his jaw setting in a way that suggested he was preparing for unwelcome news. "I cannot bear children, Mr. Mitchell. I am barren." The words hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. Sarah watched as Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disappointment, and finally something that looked very much like betrayal. "You cannot... You're certain of this?" "Completely certain. It was confirmed by multiple physicians in Philadelphia after my previous engagement ended for the same reason." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his hands clenching and unclenching on the white tablecloth. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of other diners and the clatter of dishes being cleared from nearby tables. "Miss Walsh," he said finally, his voice cold and formal, "this changes everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The words, "this changes everything," echoed in Sarah's mind as she watched Thomas Mitchell's face transform from disappointment to something approaching anger. The warmth that had characterized his letters, the gentle courtship they had conducted through correspondence, evaporated like morning mist in the Colorado sun. "You deceived me," Thomas said, his voice low but carrying the weight of accusation. 18 months of letters, 18 months of planning a future together, and you never once mentioned this fundamental impediment to marriage. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "I understand your disappointment, Mr. Mitchell. but I believed that love and partnership might transcend the simple biological function of childbearing. Simple biological function? Thomas's laugh was bitter. Miss Walsh, you clearly don't understand frontier life. Children aren't a luxury here, they're a necessity. Ranch work requires family labor. Legacy requires heirs. What exactly did you think marriage meant in this country? Other diners were beginning to glance in their direction, sensing the tension at their table. Sarah was acutely aware of curious eyes and whispered conversations, but she refused to be, cowed by public scrutiny. I thought marriage meant companionship, shared purpose, and mutual support through life's challenges, she replied quietly. I thought it meant two people building something meaningful together, regardless of biological limitations. Thomas shook his head, his jaw set in hard lines. You thought like an Eastern woman with romantic notions. Out here, we deal in practical realities. A wife who can't produce children is like a bull that can't breed, or a cow that can't calve, useless for the fundamental purposes of ranch life. The crude comparison hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had endured similar sentiments from Robert Aldridge 3 years ago, but somehow hearing them from Thomas Mitchell, who had written such tender letters about building a life together, felt even more devastating. I see, she said, fighting to maintain her composure. And what exactly are you proposing, Mr. Mitchell? Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small leather purse, counting out several bills with the mechanical precision of a man conducting unpleasant business. Your return passage to Philadelphia, plus additional funds for expenses. During the journey, I'll arrange for your trunk to be delivered to the station. The eastbound train leaves Thursday morning. Sarah stared at the money lying on the white tablecloth between them, the final symbol of her rejection and dismissal. After traveling 2,000 miles, after investing her hopes and her future in this arrangement, she was being discarded like damaged merchandise. I don't want your money, Mr. Mitchell, she said quietly, rising from her chair with as much dignity as she could muster. I wouldn't want to further burden you with expenses related to your mistake in judgment. She turned to leave, but Thomas's voice stopped her. Miss Walsh, you should understand that word travels fast in a town this size. People will ask questions about why our arrangement didn't proceed. I'll have to provide explanations. The threat was subtle but clear. Thomas Mitchell would control the narrative of her rejection, and his version would likely focus on her deception rather than his narrow-minded priorities. Sarah turned back to face him, seeing clearly for the first time the small-minded man behind the eloquent letters. Tell them whatever serves your purposes, Mr. Mitchell. I'm sure you'll find a way to emerge as the wronged party in this situation. With that, Sarah walked out of the dining room, through the hotel lobby and up the stairs to her room, maintaining her composure until the door closed behind her. Only then did she allow herself to sink onto the narrow bed and confront the reality of her situation. She was stranded in Millbrook, Colorado, with less than $20 to her name and no prospects beyond returning to Philadelphia in defeat. Her family had made it clear that they considered her decision to answer Thomas Mitchell's advertisement scandalous and inappropriate. Her brother Jonathan had written stiffly that while she would always be welcome in his household, his wife Margaret found her presence disruptive and her unmarried status embarrassing to their social standing. The thought of returning to that environment, the whispered conversations, the pitying glances, the careful exclusion from social gatherings where unmarried women of 26 were considered unfortunate reminders of spinsterhood, made Sarah's stomach clench with dread. She moved to the window and gazed out at the frontier town, settling into evening routines. Lanterns flickered to life in shop windows. Families gathered for dinner in homes visible along residential streets, and the massive Colorado sky darkened to reveal stars more brilliant than any she had seen in Philadelphia's smoke-hazed atmosphere. Millbrook was beautiful, challenging, and completely foreign to everything she had known. But it was also a place where she might have found purpose and belonging, if only she had been born with different biological capabilities. A knock at her door interrupted these melancholy thoughts. Sarah expected to find a hotel employee, perhaps, delivering her trunk or conveying some message from Thomas Mitchell. Instead, she opened the door to find a tall man in his early 30s, holding his hat respectfully in work-calloused hands. He was powerfully built, with the broad shoulders and weathered skin of someone who spent his days outdoors in Colorado's intense sunshine. His dark brown hair was shot through with premature silver, and his grey eyes held a combination of intelligence and kindness that seemed entirely different from Thomas Mitchell's calculating assessment. "Miss Walsh." "I'm James Crawford." I couldn't help but notice the discussion you had with Thomas Mitchell in the dining room. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to make sure you were all right." Sarah studied this stranger's face, noting the genuine concern in his expression and the respectful distance he maintained in the hallway. After Thomas Mitchell's cold dismissal, such simple courtesy felt like water in the desert. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Crawford, but I'm quite well, just adjusting to some unexpected changes in my circumstances." James Crawford nodded, as if this explanation made perfect sense. Thomas Mitchell has a reputation for rigid thinking when it comes to matters that don't fit his narrow expectations. Not everyone in Millbrook shares his attitudes. "I appreciate your concern, but I'll be returning to Philadelphia on Thursday's train. This town and I seem to be incompatible." Something in James Crawford's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "Miss Walsh, I hope you won't judge all of Colorado based on one man's limited perspective. This is a place where people often get second chances, where what matters most is character and determination rather than conventional expectations." The sincerity in his voice made Sarah look at him more carefully. There was something about James Crawford that suggested depth and understanding, qualities that had been notably absent from her conversation with Thomas Mitchell. "You speak as if you have personal experience with second chances, Mr. Crawford." A shadow crossed his features. "I do indeed. Sometimes life deals us circumstances that force us to redefine what we think we want and discover what we actually need." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the sound of children's voices echoed from the street below. James glanced toward the window, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something that might have been longing in his expression. "Mr. Crawford, forgive my curiosity, but do you have children?" The question seemed to surprise him, and for a moment his carefully composed demeanor cracked to reveal something raw and complicated. "I do. 6 of them, actually, though the circumstances are unconventional." Sarah felt a spark of curiosity about this man who spoke in careful phrases and seemed to carry some burden that created shadows in his grey eyes. But before she could respond, James Crawford straightened and returned to the formal politeness of their introduction. "Miss Walsh, I don't want to impose on your privacy, but if you'd be willing to accept an invitation, I'd be honored to show you some of the area around Millbrook tomorrow. You might find that Colorado has more to offer than Thomas Mitchell's narrow worldview would suggest." The invitation was completely unexpected. Sarah had resigned herself to spending the next few days in solitary misery, waiting for Thursday's train and dreading her return to Philadelphia's stifling social constraints. The prospect of exploring this beautiful country with someone who seemed genuinely kind was more appealing than she wanted to admit. "That's very generous, Mr. Crawford, but I wouldn't want to impose on your time. Surely you have responsibilities that require your attention." "Nothing that can't be adjusted for a day, and frankly, Miss Walsh, you'd be doing me a favor. It's been too long since I had the pleasure of showing someone the beauty of this country through fresh eyes." There was something in his tone that suggested loneliness, a quality Sarah recognized because she had carried it herself for so long. Perhaps they were both people who had been isolated by circumstances beyond their control. In that case, Mr. Crawford, I would be delighted to accept your invitation. James Crawford's smile transformed his entire face, revealing the warmth that had been hidden beneath his careful courtesy. Excellent. I'll call for you at 9 o'clock if that suits you. Miss Walsh? Yes. Don't let Thomas Mitchell's stupidity convince you that you don't belong in Colorado. Some of us understand that the most valuable things in life can't be measured by conventional standards. As James Crawford disappeared down the hallway, Sarah closed her door and leaned against it, her heart beating with something that might have been hope. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she felt as if she might have encountered someone who saw her as more than just a collection of biological capabilities or social expectations. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, and perhaps the chance to discover that her journey to Colorado hadn't been a complete mistake after all. The morning sun painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and rose as Sarah prepared for her outing with James Crawford. She had slept better than expected, perhaps because the prospect of exploring this magnificent country had given her something to anticipate beyond Thursday's dreaded departure. She chose a practical walking dress of deep blue cotton, sturdy enough for outdoor activities, but still maintaining the refinement expected of a Philadelphia lady. As she arranged her chestnut hair in a simple style suitable for mountain breezes, Sarah caught herself wondering about James Crawford's mysterious reference to 6 children and unconventional circumstances. Precisely at 9 o'clock, a knock announced his arrival. Sarah opened the door to find James looking considerably different from the previous evening's formal presentation. He wore practical ranch clothes, dark trousers, a white cotton shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows, and a leather vest that emphasized his powerful build. A wide-brimmed hat dangled from his hand, and his grey eyes held an enthusiasm that made him appear younger than his 30-odd years. "Good morning, Miss Walsh. I hope you're prepared for an adventure." "Good morning, Mr. Crawford. I'm looking forward to seeing your Colorado." James led her outside, where a sturdy wagon waited, hitched to 2 magnificent chestnut horses that stamped and snorted in the crisp morning air. The wagon was well maintained, but clearly built for function rather than elegance, with a wide bench, seat cushioned with colorful blankets. "I thought we'd start with the valley overlook," James explained, as he helped Sarah into the wagon with careful courtesy. "It'll give you a sense of the scope of this country. Then we can explore some of the areas where settlers are beginning to establish homesteads." As they drove through Millbrook's awakening streets, Sarah noticed how different the town looked. In daylight, what had seemed rough and frontier-crude the previous evening now appeared purposeful and energetic. Shopkeepers were opening their doors. Children ran laughing between buildings, and the general atmosphere suggested a community with confidence in its future. "How long have you lived in Millbrook, Mr. Crawford?" Sarah asked as they left the town behind and began climbing a winding trail into the foothills. "About 4 years now. I came west after—" James paused, his hands tightening slightly on the reins. "After circumstances in Missouri made a fresh start necessary." Sarah sensed pain behind his careful words, but she didn't press for details. She understood the need to leave difficult situations behind and appreciated his respect for her own privacy regarding Philadelphia. The trail wound upward through stands of aspen and pine, their leaves and needles creating a canopy that filtered the intense mountain sunlight. The air grew thinner and more crystalline as they climbed, carrying scents of pine resin, wildflowers, and something clean and wild that Sarah had never experienced in Philadelphia's urban environment. "Tell me about your ranch," Sarah said, genuinely curious about this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. James's expression grew more animated. It's about 15 miles northwest of town, in a valley that provides good grazing and protection from the worst winter storms. The previous owner built solidly. The house and outbuildings are well constructed, and there's a creek that runs year-round. And you manage it alone. Again, that shadow crossed his features. Not entirely alone. I have help with various aspects of the work. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, they crested a ridge that opened onto a vista so breathtaking it stole her words entirely. The entire Colorado Valley spread below them like a living map, with Millbrook appearing toy-like in the distance. Mountains rose in every direction, their peaks snow-capped even in late spring, and the sky stretched endlessly blue with clouds that cast moving shadows across the landscape. "My goodness," Sarah breathed, unconsciously gripping James's arm in her excitement. "I've never seen anything so magnificent." James's smile was warm with shared appreciation. "It never gets old. Sometimes I come up here just to remember how big the world is, how many possibilities exist beyond whatever problems seem overwhelming at the moment." The observation was both philosophical and personal, suggesting that James Crawford was a man who had faced significant challenges and found ways to maintain perspective. Sarah found herself increasingly curious about his background and the experiences that had shaped his thoughtful nature. They spent several minutes in comfortable silence, absorbing the grandeur of the Colorado landscape. Then James pointed toward a distant valley visible to the northwest. "That's where my ranch is located. The buildings are too far away to see clearly, but on a clear day like this, you can make out the general layout of the valley." Sarah shaded her eyes and tried to distinguish details in the far landscape. "It must be beautiful country for raising cattle." "It is. And it's good country for raising—" James stopped mid-sentence, seeming to catch himself before revealing something he wasn't ready to share. "For raising what, Mr. Crawford?" James was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes distant with what appeared to be internal debate. Finally, he turned to face Sarah directly. "Miss Walsh, before we go any further, there's something you should know about my circumstances. Something that most people in Millbrook consider unusual, and that might affect your willingness to continue our acquaintance." Sarah felt a familiar chill of anticipation. Was James Crawford about to reveal some disqualifying characteristic, just as she had done with Thomas Mitchell? The irony would be devastating. "I'm listening, Mr. Crawford." James took a deep breath, his weathered hands gripping the wagon reins more tightly. "The 6 children I mentioned last night aren't my biological children. They're orphans I've taken in over the past 3 years. This was not what Sarah had expected. She studied James's face, seeing anxiety and something that might have been shame in his expression. "Orphans. The first 2 came to me when their parents died in a fever epidemic that swept through the mining camps. Billy was 8, his sister Emma was 5. They had no other family, and the territorial authorities were going to separate them and send them to different institutions back east." James's voice grew quieter as he continued. "I couldn't let that happen. They were so frightened, so lost. My ranch had plenty of space, and I had no family of my own to consider. And the other 4 came one by one over the following years. Mary and Joseph, brother and sister, whose parents died in a mining accident. Little Ruth, whose mother died in childbirth and whose father couldn't care for an infant while working his claim. And most recently Daniel, who's 15 and was working dangerous jobs in the mines until I convinced him he deserved better." Sarah absorbed this information, understanding now the unconventional circumstances James had referenced. In an era when orphanages and institutions were considered the proper solution for parentless children, his decision to create an informal family was indeed unusual. "So you're raising 6 orphaned children on your ranch?" "I am. And before you Ask, yes, it's challenging. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, it's complicated in ways I never anticipated when I made the first decision to take in Billy and Emma. James turned to look directly at Sarah, his grey eyes intense with something that might have been defiance. But it's also the most meaningful thing I've ever done. Those children have brought purpose and joy to my life in ways I never expected. They've made my ranch a home instead of just a place where I work and sleep. Sarah found herself deeply moved by James's quiet passion as he described his unusual family. The contrast with Thomas Mitchell's cold calculations about children as economic necessities was stark and revealing. What does the community think about your arrangement? James's laugh was somewhat bitter. Mixed opinions. Some folks admire what they consider Christian charity. Others think I'm either a saint or a fool, depending on their own experiences with children. A few worry that I'm not providing proper moral guidance without a wife's influence. And what do you think? I think those children deserved better than institutions or separation from their siblings. I think they've thrived with stability, education, and someone who genuinely cares about their welfare. And I think conventional families aren't the only way to create love and security. The sincerity in James's voice, the obvious depth of his commitment to these orphan children, touched something deep in Sarah's heart. Here was a man who had chosen to build a family based on need and love rather than biological connection. Exactly the kind of thinking that might value a woman for her character rather than her childbearing capacity. "Mr. Crawford," she said, quietly, "I think what you've done is remarkable." James's expression showed surprise and something that might have been relief. Most people find it admirable in theory, but impractical in reality. Most people haven't faced the reality of being judged by biological limitations beyond their control, Sarah replied, then caught herself before revealing too much about her own circumstances. James studied her face with new interest. "Miss Walsh, I sense that you speak from personal experience with being judged by conventional standards." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but James's understanding expression encouraged honesty rather than defensiveness. "Let's just say that I understand what it means to be considered inadequate by society's narrow definitions of worth and purpose." James nodded slowly, and Sarah saw recognition in his grey eyes, the look of someone who understood exclusion and the need to prove value in non-traditional ways. "In that case," he said with a warm smile, "perhaps you'd like to meet my unconventional family. I think you might find them more accepting than most conventional societies." The Crawford Ranch sprawled across a valley so picturesque, it seemed, designed by an artist rather than carved by nature. As their wagon descended the winding trail, Sarah could see a substantial log house with a wide front porch, surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings that spoke to James's skill as both rancher and caretaker. Smoke curled from the kitchen chimney, and clothes hung on lines strung between tall pine trees, creating a scene of domestic tranquility that seemed almost too perfect to be real. "It's beautiful, Mr. Crawford," Sarah said, genuinely impressed by the obvious care and attention that had gone into maintaining the property. "You've created something remarkable here." James's face showed pride mixed with anxiety. "The children have helped more than they know. Having people to care for gave me reason to make this place a proper home instead of just a working ranch." As they approached the house, Sarah could hear voices, children's laughter mixed with what sounded like a spirited discussion about something involving chickens and arithmetic. The sound made her heart clench with unexpected longing. These were the voices of family life she had always dreamed of, but never expected to experience. "They know you're coming," James said, noticing her expression. "I sent Daniel into town yesterday evening to let them know I'd be bringing a guest today." Fair warning, they're curious about you, especially since visitors are rare out here. The front door burst open before James could help Sarah down from the wagon, and children began spilling onto the porch in a cascade of excitement and barely controlled energy. Sarah's first impression was of bright faces, eager eyes, and the kind of healthy chaos that suggested children who felt secure enough to express themselves freely. Pa James, called the tallest boy, who had to be 15-year-old Daniel. Was lean and wiry, with dark hair and serious brown eyes that seemed older than his years. "Did you see the new calf? She's standing already, and Billy thinks we should name her Buttercup." "We should not name her Buttercup," protested a boy of about 8 with sandy hair and freckles covering his sun-browned face. This had to be Billy, the first orphan James had taken in. "That's a silly name for a cow. Cows should have proper names like Duchess or Brunhilde." "Brunhilde is not a proper name for anything," laughed a girl who appeared to be about 12, with long braids and intelligent green eyes. She wiped flour-dusted hands on her apron as she studied Sarah with frank curiosity. "You must be Miss Walsh. I'm Mary, and I've been making bread for your visit." Before Sarah could respond, a smaller girl with enormous blue eyes and blonde curls pushed forward. "I'm Emma, and I helped with the bread, except I spilled flour everywhere, and Mary says I'm more hindrance than help. But I don't think that's true because I swept it up mostly." The rapid-fire introduction made Sarah smile despite her nervousness. Emma couldn't have been more than 7 now, but her chatter suggested a personality that filled whatever space she occupied. "Emma, let Miss Walsh get down from the wagon before you talk her ear off," said Daniel, with the long-suffering tone of an older sibling. He moved to help Sarah dismount, displaying the kind of courtesy that spoke to James's influence on his character. "Thank you, Daniel," Sarah said, accepting his assistance, "and it's lovely to meet all of you." As her feet touched the ground, Sarah became aware of 2 more children hanging back slightly. A boy of perhaps 10 with dark hair and solemn eyes, and a toddler with auburn curls who clung to Mary's skirts while studying Sarah with the intense focus of very young children. "That's Joseph," Mary explained, following Sarah's gaze, "and little Ruth. Joseph's shy with strangers, and Ruth doesn't remember much about anyone except us." James moved to Sarah's side, his hand briefly touching her elbow in a gesture of support. "Children, Miss Walsh has come all the way from Philadelphia. She's never seen a working ranch before, so I thought we might show her around and perhaps convince her that Colorado has something to offer besides Thomas Mitchell's narrow opinions." Sarah caught the meaningful look that passed between James and Daniel, suggesting that word of her rejection had reached the ranch despite its remote location. The realization that these children knew about her humiliation should have been embarrassing, but instead she felt oddly comforted by their matter-of-fact acceptance of her situation. "Thomas Mitchell is a horse's rear end," Billy announced, with the brutal honesty of childhood, earning immediate reproofs from his older siblings. "Billy Crawford, you watch your language," Mary scolded, though Sarah noticed she didn't actually disagree with the sentiment. "But he is, though," Emma added helpfully. "He came here once and said we were an unnatural family and that Pa James was doing something wrong by keeping us together instead of sending us to proper institutions." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group as the children realized they had strayed into adult territory that might be sensitive for their guest. Sarah looked around at their worried faces and felt a surge of protective indignation on their behalf. "Well," she said firmly, "I think Mr. Mitchell is entitled to his opinions, but that doesn't make them correct. Anyone can see that this is a wonderful family, and you're all very fortunate to have each other and your Pa James." The relief on the children's faces was immediate and touching. Daniel straightened with visible pride, Mary beamed, and even shy Joseph stepped forward slightly. "Would you like to see the animals?" Emma asked, bouncing with renewed enthusiasm. "We have horses and cows and chickens and a pig named Napoleon who thinks he's a dog." "I would love to see the animals," Sarah replied, charmed by Emma's infectious energy. What followed was the most delightful tour Sarah had ever experienced. The children took turns explaining the ranch's operations with a mixture of practical knowledge and childish enthusiasm that demonstrated both their genuine involvement in the work and their security in this environment. Billy showed off his skill with the horses, proudly demonstrating how he could bridle and saddle James's gentlest mare. Mary led Sarah through the kitchen garden, pointing out vegetables and herbs with the expertise of someone who understood the practical necessity of growing food. Joseph, gradually warming to Sarah's genuine interest, explained the intricacies of chicken care with surprising depth for a 10-year-old. Daniel, clearly the most serious of the group, took responsibility for showing Sarah the more complex aspects of ranch management: the pasture rotation system, the hay storage, and the careful record-keeping that ensured the operation's success. "Pa James taught me to read and write proper," Daniel explained, as he showed Sarah the ledger where ranch expenses and income were meticulously recorded. "Says a man needs to understand numbers if he wants to make his way in the world. Some of the other boys in town can barely write their names, but all of us can do sums and read books." "All of you attend school?" Sarah asked, curious about educational opportunities in such a remote location. "Pa James teaches us," Mary replied. "Every morning after chores, we have lessons in reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography. In the evenings, he reads to us from books he orders from Denver. We've heard all of Dickens and most of Shakespeare, though the little ones don't understand the big words yet." Sarah was impressed by the scope of education James was providing. Many children in Philadelphia's working-class neighborhoods received less comprehensive schooling than these ranch children were getting from their adoptive father. "And what about you, Miss Walsh?" Emma asked with the directness of childhood. "Do you know about books and learning? Pa James says you're very educated because you came from a big city." Before Sarah could answer, little Ruth toddled over and raised her arms, clearly wanting to be picked up. Without thinking, Sarah scooped the child into her arms, marveling at the trusting way Ruth settled against her shoulder. "I do love books and learning," Sarah said, unconsciously swaying slightly. To comfort the toddler, "In Philadelphia, I helped teach reading to women who had never had the opportunity to learn. Could you teach us new things?" Billy asked eagerly. "Pa James is smart, but he says there's always more to learn than any one person can know." The innocent question hit Sarah with unexpected force. Here were children who valued education, who were eager to learn, who saw knowledge as a gift rather than a burden. The contrast with Thomas Mitchell's purely economic view of children's purpose was stark and heartening. "I would love to share what I know," Sarah replied, meaning it more than she had expected. James, who had been quietly observing these interactions, stepped forward with an expression that combined pride in his children and something that might have been hope. "Miss Walsh, would you consider staying for dinner? Mary has prepared enough food for a small army, and I think the children would enjoy hearing more about life in Philadelphia." Looking around at the eager faces surrounding her, feeling Ruth's warm weight in her arms, and seeing the genuine welcome in their eyes, Sarah realized that for the first time since arriving in Colorado, she felt genuinely wanted, not for what she could provide or produce, but simply for who she was. "I would be honored to stay for dinner," she said, and the chorus of cheers that greeted her acceptance made her heart swell with an emotion she couldn't quite name. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself naturally slipping into the rhythm of ranch family life. She helped Mary in the kitchen, listened to Billy's enthusiastic stories about his favorite horses, played simple games with Emma and Ruth, and engaged in surprisingly sophisticated conversations with Daniel and Joseph about books and ideas. The time James announced it was time to return her to town, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of what family could mean. These children hadn't been born to James Crawford, but they were unmistakably his in every way that mattered. And more importantly, she felt more like herself in their company than she had in years. The ride back to Millbrook passed in contemplative silence, both Sarah and James lost in thoughts about the afternoon's revelations. The sun was setting behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple that seemed to set the entire landscape ablaze. Sarah found herself reluctant for the day to end, knowing that tomorrow would bring Thursday's eastbound train and her return to Philadelphia's suffocating constraints. As they reached the outskirts of town, James finally broke the comfortable quiet between them. "Miss Walsh, I hope the children didn't overwhelm you. They're not accustomed to visitors, especially educated ladies from back east." "Mr. Crawford, your children are remarkable. Their intelligence, their curiosity, their genuine warmth. You've created something extraordinary with that family." James's hands tightened on the reins, and Sarah caught a glimpse of emotion crossing his weathered features in the fading light. "They've created something extraordinary with me, more accurately. 3 years ago, I was a bitter widower convinced that my life held no purpose beyond work and solitude. Those children gave me reason to become better than I thought I could be." "You were married before?" Sarah asked gently, sensing pain behind his words. "For 2 years. Margaret died in childbirth, along with our son. The doctor said there were complications that couldn't be foreseen or prevented." James's voice grew quiet with old grief. "I blamed myself for a long time. Wondered if bringing her west had been selfish, if she might have survived in a place with better medical facilities." Sarah felt her heart clench with sympathy for his loss and recognition of the parallels in their experiences with unfulfilled dreams of traditional family life. "I'm so sorry for your loss, James." The use of his first name slipped out naturally, and Sarah realized that somewhere during the afternoon the formal boundaries between them had dissolved into something more personal and genuine. "Thank you. It's been 4 years now, and the sharp edges of grief have softened, but it left me convinced that marriage and family weren't meant for me. Then Billy and Emma needed help, and suddenly I discovered that family doesn't always come through the conventional channels." They had reached the hotel, but neither moved to end their conversation. The evening air was crisp with approaching night, and the sounds of Millbrook settling into its evening routines created a backdrop of domestic tranquility. "Sarah," James said, turning to face her directly, "may I ask what brought you to answer Thomas Mitchell's advertisement? A woman of your obvious education and refinement surely had other options in Philadelphia." Sarah felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach, but James's understanding expression encouraged honesty rather than defensiveness. "The same reason you thought marriage wasn't meant for you, I suppose. Circumstances convinced me that conventional family life was impossible. For me, because you can't bear children." The statement was gentle but direct, and Sarah realized that James had understood more from their previous conversations than she had revealed explicitly. "You knew, I suspected. The way you spoke about being judged by biological limitations, your understanding when I mentioned that conventional families aren't the only way to create love and security, and the way you interacted with my children today, there was longing there, the kind that comes from wanting something you've been told you can't have." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but James's matter-of-fact tone made her confession feel less like a shameful admission and more like a simple fact to be acknowledged. 3 years ago, I was engaged to a prominent Philadelphia businessman. When physicians confirmed that I would never conceive, he ended our engagement immediately, said he couldn't build a legacy with a woman who couldn't provide heirs. "Robert Aldridge was a fool," James said firmly. "Any man who would judge a woman's worth by such narrow criteria doesn't deserve the privilege of her partnership." The certainty in his voice, so different from Thomas Mitchell's cold calculations or Robert Aldridge's cruel dismissal, made Sarah look at him with new eyes. "You truly believe that?" "Sarah, I've spent the last 4 hours watching you with my children. I've seen how naturally you engage with their questions, how instinctively you respond to their needs, how easily you fit into the rhythm of family life. Any man would be fortunate to have you as a partner, regardless of biological circumstances." The sincerity in James's grey eyes was overwhelming. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of shame and inadequacy she had carried for 3 years. "James, what are you saying?" Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. A group of riders emerged from the gathering darkness, led by a figure Sarah recognized with a sinking heart as Thomas Mitchell. Behind him rode 3 men she didn't recognize, all wearing the kind of formal clothes that suggested official business rather than casual evening travel. Thomas guided his horse close to their wagon, his expression stern and purposeful in the lamplight spilling from the hotel's windows. "Miss Walsh, Mr. Crawford, how convenient to find you together." "Thomas," James acknowledged coolly, "what brings you into town so late?" "Official business, I'm afraid. Miss Walsh, I believe you should be aware that questions have been raised about your presence in Millbrook and your associations since your arrival." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. "What sort of questions, Mr. Mitchell?" One of Thomas's companions, a thin man with cold eyes and an official bearing, urged his horse forward. "Miss Walsh, I'm Federal Marshal William Hayes. I've received reports about a woman traveling under potentially fraudulent circumstances, claiming to be a mail-order bride, while concealing material facts that would affect such arrangements." "Fraudulent circumstances?" Sarah's voice rose with indignation. "I've committed no fraud, Marshal Hayes. Haven't you?" Thomas's voice carried smug satisfaction. "You corresponded with me for 18 months without revealing your inability to bear children. Some might consider that deliberate deception designed to trap an unsuspecting man into marriage." James straightened beside Sarah, his voice carrying dangerous quiet. "Thomas, you're walking on thin ice. Miss Walsh's personal circumstances are none of your business, and certainly not a matter for federal intervention." "Aren't they?" Thomas's smile was coldly triumphant. "When a woman travels across territorial boundaries, using the mail system to engage in what amounts to matrimonial fraud, it becomes a federal concern, especially when she then begins forming inappropriate associations with other men immediately. After her deception is discovered, the accusation hung in the evening air like poison." Sarah realized with growing horror that Thomas Mitchell had orchestrated this confrontation as revenge for her rejection of his money and her dignified departure from their disastrous dinner. "Marshal Hayes," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice. "Steady. I have committed no crime. My correspondence with Mr. Mitchell was conducted in good faith, and I never claimed capabilities I didn't possess." "Perhaps not explicitly," the Marshal replied, consulting a document from his saddlebag. "But a mission of material facts in correspondence designed to secure marriage arrangements could be construed as fraudulent intent under territorial law." "This is ridiculous," James said flatly. "Thomas, what exactly do you hope to accomplish with this performance?" "Justice, Crawford, and protection of other potential victims from Miss Walsh's deceptive practices." A second official-looking man spoke up for the first time. "Miss Walsh, I'm Territorial Agent Marcus Webb. We've also received concerns about your current living arrangements and associations. A single woman of questionable character forming immediate attachments with local men raises questions about moral fitness and potential disruption of community standards." Sarah felt the familiar crushing weight of being judged by society's narrow standards. But this time, the stakes were far higher than social embarrassment. These men were suggesting criminal behavior and moral unfitness that could result in forced removal from Colorado, or worse. "Gentlemen," James said, his voice carrying authority Sarah hadn't heard before, "you're making serious accusations without evidence. Miss Walsh has conducted herself with complete propriety since arriving in Millbrook. If Thomas Mitchell has convinced you otherwise, you've been misled by a man with personal grievances rather than legitimate concerns." "Have we?" Thomas's eyes glittered with malice. "Crawford, your own situation hardly makes you a credible character witness. A widower living alone with 6 unrelated children, no proper female supervision, creating an irregular household that defies conventional family structures." The attack on James's family arrangement made Sarah's blood boil. She had spent the afternoon witnessing the love, stability, and moral guidance James provided those children, and seeing it characterized as improper or irregular filled her with protective fury. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the refined steel she had learned in Philadelphia's drawing rooms, "your attack on Mr. Crawford's family reveals more about your character than his. Those children are fortunate to have a father who values their welfare over social conventions." "Father?" Thomas laughed harshly. "Crawford has no legal relationship to those children. For all we know, his motivations for collecting orphans might be less than pure." The implication was so vile that Sarah gasped, but James's reaction was swift and controlled. He stepped down from the wagon with fluid grace, his powerful frame conveying barely leashed violence. "Thomas, you'll apologize for that remark immediately, or we'll settle this matter in a way that doesn't require federal marshals." The threat was quiet but unmistakable. Marshal Hayes moved his horse between the two men, clearly recognizing the potential for violence. "Gentlemen, that's enough. Miss Walsh, given the concerns that have been raised, I'm afraid you'll need to appear before the territorial magistrate tomorrow morning to address these allegations." "What allegations specifically?" Sarah demanded, though her heart was racing with fear. "Potential mail fraud, misrepresentation in matrimonial correspondence, and conduct prejudicial to community moral standards," Agent Webb replied formally. "The hearing will determine whether criminal charges are warranted or whether administrative remedies are sufficient." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. She had come to Colorado seeking a new life, and instead found herself facing accusations that could destroy any hope of building a future anywhere. James moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Despite the chaos surrounding them, Sarah, don't let them intimidate you. These charges are baseless, and any fair hearing will establish your innocence." But as Sarah looked at Thomas Mitchell's satisfied expression and the marshal's official demeanor, she wondered if fairness would be possible when powerful men were, determined to see her punished for the crime of being different from their narrow expectations. Dawn broke grey and cold over Millbrook, with threatening clouds gathering around the mountain peaks like a physical manifestation of Sarah's anxiety. She had barely slept, spending the night alternating between pacing her small hotel room and staring out the window at the town that had briefly offered hope before becoming the stage for her potential destruction. The territorial magistrate's hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the town hall, giving Sarah precious few hours to prepare a defense against charges that seemed designed more to humiliate than to seek justice. She dressed carefully in her most conservative outfit, a black wool dress with minimal ornamentation that suggested respectability and seriousness rather than vanity or deception. A soft knock at her door interrupted her anxious preparations. Sarah opened it, expecting to find James, or perhaps hotel staff, but instead discovered a woman she didn't recognize standing in the hallway. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with prematurely silver hair and intelligent hazel eyes that conveyed both kindness and determination. "Miss Walsh," I'm Dr. Eleanor Hartwell. I arrived on the morning stage from Denver after receiving urgent word about your situation. Dr. Hartwell, I'm sorry I don't understand. Eleanor stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to taking charge of difficult situations. I'm a physician specializing in women's health, and I serve on the Territorial Women's Rights Committee. Word of your case reached us through unofficial channels, and we believe your situation represents broader issues that need addressing. Sarah felt a flutter of hope mixed with confusion. Someone contacted you about my hearing. James Crawford sent an urgent telegram yesterday evening. He provided enough details for us to understand that you're facing charges based on prejudicial attitudes toward women who cannot bear children. Eleanor's voice carried professional authority mixed with personal indignation. Such persecution cannot be allowed to stand unchallenged. Before Sarah could respond, more footsteps echoed in the hallway. James appeared at the top of the stairs, accompanied by a distinguished gentleman in a fine suit who carried himself with the bearing of legal authority. Sarah, James said, relief evident in his voice. Dr. Hartwell arrived as promised, and this is attorney Benjamin Foster from Colorado Springs. He's agreed to represent you at this morning's hearing. Attorney Foster stepped forward with a slight bow. Miss Walsh, I've reviewed the allegations against you, and I can assure you that they constitute a gross misuse of territorial law. We will demonstrate that these charges are without merit and motivated by personal vendetta rather than legitimate legal concerns. Sarah felt overwhelmed by this unexpected support. Mr. Foster, Dr. Hartwell, I'm grateful for your assistance, but I'm afraid I have limited resources to compensate you for— Miss Walsh, Dr. Hartwell interrupted firmly. This case affects far more than your individual circumstances. If territorial authorities can criminalize women for failing to disclose medical conditions that prevent childbearing, no woman in the West is safe from similar persecution. Attorney Foster nodded agreement. The legal precedent would be disastrous. We're fighting for principles that transcend your specific situation, though we're certainly committed to clearing your name in the process. James moved closer to Sarah, his grey eyes intense with emotion she was beginning to recognize as more than simple friendship. Sarah, I want you to know that whatever happens at this hearing, you have people who believe in you and will stand by you. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of multiple footsteps on the hotel stairs announced new arrivals. To her amazement, she saw Mary Crawford emerging onto the landing, followed by Daniel and the other children, all dressed in their finest clothes despite the early hour. "Miss Sarah!" Emma called out, running to embrace her with the unconscious affection of childhood. Pa James told us about the mean men who are trying to say bad things about you, but we're here to tell everyone that you're wonderful and kind, and they're just being stupid. Emma, Mary scolded gently, though her expression showed she shared her younger sister's sentiments. We discussed using proper language. Daniel stepped forward with the serious demeanor that made him seem older than his 15 years. Miss Walsh, we know you didn't do anything wrong. We wanted to be here to speak for you if they'll let us. Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes at the children's loyalty and support. After a lifetime of being judged and found wanting, their simple faith in her character was almost overwhelming. Children, you shouldn't have to— Yes, we should. Mary interrupted with quiet determination. You're part of our family now, and families stand together when there's trouble. The casual declaration that she was part of their family hit Sarah with unexpected force. These children, who had known her for less than 24 hours, had somehow decided she belonged with them in a way that seemed natural and permanent. James's expression as he watched his children defend Sarah revealed depths of emotion that made her heart race with possibilities she hadn't dared to consider. We should head to the town hall, Attorney Foster said, consulting his pocket watch. I want time to review the formal charges and speak with any witnesses before the hearing begins. The walk to Millbrook's town hall became an impromptu procession. Word of the hearing had spread through the small community overnight, and Sarah was amazed to see townspeople gathering along Main Street, many offering words of encouragement and support. Mrs. Patterson from the hotel pressed a basket of food into her hands, for after this nonsense is settled. The general store owner tipped his hat respectfully, and several women Sarah didn't even know nodded in solidarity. The town hall was packed beyond capacity, with additional chairs arranged in aisles and people standing along the walls. Sarah realized that her case had become a community event, though whether the crowd was sympathetic or hostile remained to be seen. Territorial Magistrate Harrison Pierce called the hearing to order with the formal gravity appropriate to legal proceedings. A man in his 60s with steel-grey hair and penetrating blue eyes, Pierce had the bearing of someone who had seen enough frontier justice to distinguish between legitimate legal concerns and personal vendettas. This hearing will address allegations of mail fraud and conduct prejudicial to community standards brought against Miss Sarah Catherine Walsh, Pierce announced. Federal Marshal Hayes, please present your case. Marshal Hayes rose and outlined the charges in formal legal language that made Sarah's private heartbreak sound like calculated criminal enterprise. He presented Thomas Mitchell's correspondence as evidence of deliberate deception, suggesting that Sarah's failure to disclose her inability to bear children constituted fraud designed to trap unsuspecting men into marriage. Furthermore, Hayes continued, Miss Walsh's immediate formation of inappropriate associations with local men after her deception was discovered suggests a pattern of behavior prejudicial to community moral standards. The characterization of her friendship with James as inappropriate associations made Sarah's cheeks burn with indignation, but Attorney Foster had coached her to remain calm and dignified regardless of provocation. Thomas Mitchell took the witness stand with obvious satisfaction, presenting himself as the victim of Sarah's alleged deception. His testimony painted her as a calculating woman who had deliberately misrepresented herself to secure marriage and financial security. Gentlemen, Thomas concluded, addressing the magistrate in the packed room, we must protect our communities from women who would use matrimonial correspondence to perpetrate fraud against honest men seeking legitimate family relationships. The audience's reaction was mixed, some nodding approval, while others shifted uncomfortably at the harsh characterization of Sarah's circumstances. Attorney Foster's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. He established that Sarah had never explicitly claimed ability to bear children, that her correspondence with Thomas had been conducted in good faith, and that Thomas's rejection had been based on personal preference rather than actual deception. Mr. Mitchell, Foster said pointedly, did Miss Walsh ever state that she could bear children in any of her letters? Well, no, but did she ever make promises about providing heirs or continuing family lines? The implication was clear. Mr. Mitchell, I'm asking about explicit statements, not your personal interpretations. Did Miss Walsh make any false claims about her physical capabilities? Thomas's face reddened with frustration. No explicit claims, but any reasonable man would assume. Assumptions, Mr. Mitchell, are not evidence of fraud. Attorney Foster then called Dr. Hartwell as an expert witness. Her testimony was devastating to the prosecution's case, establishing that infertility was a medical condition rather than a moral failing, and that women had no legal obligation to disclose such private medical information in matrimonial correspondence. Magistrate Pierce, Dr. Hartwell concluded, criminalizing women for failing to disclose medical conditions would create a legal precedent that would strip women of privacy rights and medical confidentiality. Such precedent would be both unconstitutional and unconscionable. When James took the stand as a character witness, his testimony about Sarah's interaction with his children and her obvious moral character was powerful and heartfelt. But it was the children's testimony that proved most compelling. Daniel spoke with mature eloquence about Sarah's kindness and natural teaching ability. Mary described how Sarah had helped with kitchen work and shown genuine interest in their family life. Even little Emma was allowed to tell the magistrate about how Sarah had picked up Ruth and made her feel safe. "She's good with babies," Emma concluded with the devastating logic of childhood, "so it doesn't matter if she can't make new ones. There are lots of babies who need taking care of, and she'd be really good at that." The courtroom was silent as Emma's words hung in the air, encapsulating in simple terms what the adults had been struggling to articulate through legal arguments and expert testimony. Magistrate Pierce called for a brief recess, during which Sarah found herself surrounded by supportive community members who had clearly decided that Thomas Mitchell's vindictive prosecution was an affront to basic decency. When the hearing reconvened, Pierce's expression suggested he had reached a decision that would not please the prosecution. Magistrate Pierce returned to his seat with the measured deliberation of a man who understood that his decision would resonate far beyond the confines of this small Colorado courtroom. The packed town hall fell silent as he arranged his papers and fixed his penetrating blue gaze first on the prosecution, then on Sarah, and finally on the assembled community members who had turned out to witness this unprecedented hearing. "In my 30 years of territorial service," Pierce began, his voice carrying the authority of extensive legal experience, "I have presided over countless cases involving disputes between individuals with competing interests and conflicting perspectives on justice. Rarely, however, have I encountered a case that so clearly illustrates the difference between law and persecution." Thomas Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence beginning to show cracks as the magistrate's tone suggested unfavorable conclusions. "The charges before this court allege mail fraud and conduct prejudicial to community moral standards," Pierce continued. "Let me address each allegation separately and definitively." Sarah felt James's reassuring presence beside her as the magistrate began his analysis, but her heart continued racing with the knowledge that her entire future hung on the next few minutes. "Regarding the allegation of mail fraud," Pierce said, his voice growing more forceful, "the prosecution has failed to demonstrate any explicit false statements made by Miss Walsh in her correspondence with Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Foster's cross-examination clearly established that the alleged deception consists entirely of omissions and assumptions rather than actual fraudulent claims." Marshal Hayes frowned deeply, recognizing that his case was being systematically dismantled. "Furthermore," Pierce continued, "the prosecution's argument requires this court to establish a legal precedent that would criminalize women for failing to disclose private medical information in matrimonial correspondence. Such a precedent would violate fundamental principles of medical privacy and create a discriminatory standard that would subject women to criminal prosecution for biological circumstances beyond their control." Dr. Hartwell nodded approvingly from her seat, clearly satisfied that her expert testimony had influenced the magistrate's reasoning. "The law cannot and will not be used as an instrument of revenge against individuals whose only crime is failing to meet the personal expectations of disappointed suitors," Pierce declared, his gaze moving pointedly to Thomas Mitchell. "Mr. Mitchell's dissatisfaction with Miss Walsh's circumstances does not constitute grounds for criminal prosecution." The courtroom erupted in scattered applause, quickly suppressed as Pierce called for order. "Regarding the allegations of conduct prejudicial to community moral standards," the magistrate continued, "the prosecution has presented no evidence of actual impropriety. Miss Walsh's friendship with Mr. Crawford and his family appears to be characterized by mutual respect, shared values, and entirely appropriate behavior. Sarah felt relief beginning to flood through her system, but Pierce wasn't finished with his analysis. Indeed, the testimony presented by Mr. Crawford's children suggests that Miss Walsh's presence in their lives has been wholly beneficial and morally uplifting. Their unsolicited defense of her character speaks more powerfully than any formal testimony could regarding her true nature and influence. Little Emma beamed with pride at having her words recognized as important evidence, while Daniel and Mary exchanged satisfied glances. "Moreover," Pierce said, his tone growing stern as he addressed the broader implications of the case, "this court notes with concern the apparent coordination between Mr. Mitchell and federal authorities to use territorial law as an instrument of personal vindication. Such abuse of legal process undermines the integrity of our judicial system and cannot be tolerated." Thomas Mitchell's face had gone pale, clearly recognizing that the magistrate's criticism extended beyond simply dismissing the charges. "Therefore," Pierce announced with finality, "this court finds the allegations against Miss Sarah Catherine Walsh to be completely without merit. All charges are hereby dismissed, and Miss Walsh is free to continue her residence in Colorado without further harassment or persecution." The courtroom exploded in cheers and applause that continued, despite Pierce's attempts to maintain order. Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her cheeks as community members rushed forward to offer congratulations and support. James's strong arms enveloped her in an embrace that felt like coming home after a long and difficult journey. "It's over, Sarah," he whispered against her hair. "You're safe, and you're free to build whatever life you choose here." But Magistrate Pierce wasn't finished. As the celebration continued around them, he called for silence and fixed Thomas Mitchell with a withering stare. "Mr. Mitchell, this court has serious concerns about your role in orchestrating these baseless accusations. Your conduct suggests a vindictive use of legal process that borders on malicious prosecution." Thomas rose from his seat, his earlier arrogance replaced by defensive anxiety. "Magistrate Pierce, I was simply protecting the community from you were seeking revenge against a woman who had the dignity to reject your money and refused to be intimidated by your threats," Pierce interrupted sharply. "Your actions have wasted territorial resources, damaged an innocent woman's reputation, and demonstrated a profound disregard for justice." The magistrate leaned forward, his voice carrying unmistakable warning. "Mr. Mitchell, you will make no further attempts to harass Miss Walsh or interfere with her life in Colorado. Any future actions that could be construed as retaliation or persecution will result in contempt charges and possible criminal prosecution for abuse of legal process." Thomas Mitchell's face cycled through anger, humiliation, and finally, what appeared to be recognition that his campaign against Sarah had backfired spectacularly. He stormed from the courtroom without another word, followed by the federal marshal and territorial agent, who had clearly realized they had been manipulated into supporting a vindictive personal vendetta. As the official proceedings concluded, and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by the Crawford children, all talking excitedly about the hearing's outcome and their successful defense of their chosen family member. "Miss Sarah," Emma announced with the unconscious authority of childhood, "now that the mean men are gone, you can stay with us forever and help Pa James take care of everybody." "Emma," Mary cautioned, though her expression suggested she shared her sister's sentiment, "that's not our decision to make." Daniel stepped forward with the serious demeanor that made him seem far older than his 15 years. "Miss Walsh, we want you to know that you'll always have a place with our family, whatever you decide about your future. The simple declaration from these children who had known her for such a short time was almost overwhelming in its generosity and acceptance. Sarah looked around at their eager faces and felt something settle in her chest, a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. Dr. Hartwell approached as the children scattered to examine the now empty magistrate's bench and other courtroom fixtures that had suddenly become fascinating. "Miss Walsh, I hope you understand that your case represents a significant victory for women's rights throughout the territories. Your courage in facing these accusations will make it harder for other women to be persecuted for similar circumstances." "Dr. Hartwell, I'm not sure I was particularly courageous. I simply tried to maintain my dignity in an impossible situation." "Sometimes dignity in the face of persecution is the highest form of courage," Dr. Hartwell replied with a warm smile. "You've proven that women cannot be criminalized for biological circumstances beyond their control. That precedent will protect countless others." Attorney Foster joined their conversation, his professional satisfaction evident in his expression. "Miss Walsh, I'm pleased to inform you that Magistrate Pierce's ruling creates exactly the legal precedent we hope to establish. Future cases involving similar accusations will reference today's decision as protective precedent for women facing discrimination based on medical conditions." As the legal and political implications of her case were explained, Sarah began to understand that her personal struggle had become part of a larger movement toward justice and equality. The realization was both humbling and empowering. James appeared at her side as the last of the well-wishers departed, his grey eyes holding an intensity that made her heart skip. "Sarah, now that this ordeal is behind you, we need to discuss your future plans. The eastbound train leaves in 2 hours, but I'm hoping you'll consider staying in Colorado." "James, Before you answer," he interrupted gently, "there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said yesterday but didn't have the courage to voice." Sarah felt her breath catch as James moved closer, his weathered hands reaching for hers with the careful reverence of a man handling something precious. "I love you, Sarah, not despite your circumstances, but because of who you are, your strength, your kindness, your natural way with children, your courage in facing adversity. I love the way my children have embraced you as family, and I love how naturally you fit into our unconventional life." The words Sarah had never dared hope to hear hung in the air between them, transforming everything she had believed about her future and her worth. "James," she whispered, tears flowing freely now, "I love you too. I love your children, your ranch, the life you've built through determination and love rather than conventional expectations." "Then stay, Sarah. Marry me, not because you need security or I need domestic help, but because we've found something rare and precious together. Help me raise these children who already consider you family. Help me build a life based on love, rather than society's narrow definitions of what family should look like." As Sarah looked into James's eyes and saw her future reflected there, a future filled with purpose, love, and the family she had always dreamed of but never thought possible, she realized that Thomas Mitchell's cruel rejection had led her exactly where she belonged. "Yes, James," she said, her voice strong with certainty. "Yes to everything." 6 months later, the Crawford Ranch had transformed into something that resembled a small educational institution more than a simple cattle operation. Sarah stood on the front porch in the golden light of an October morning, watching her students, for that's what the neighborhood children had become, arrive for their daily lessons in the converted barn that now served as Millbrook's first official schoolhouse. The Territorial Education Authority had been so impressed with Sarah's innovative teaching methods and the dramatic improvement in local children's literacy that they had appointed her as the region's first certified frontier educator. What had begun as informal lessons for the Crawford children had evolved into a comprehensive school serving families within a 20-mile radius of the ranch. "Mrs. Crawford," called 12-year-old Timothy Harrison as he dismounted from his pony, "I finished reading that book about President Lincoln you lent me. Can we talk about it during today's history lesson?" "Of course, Timothy. I'm eager to hear your thoughts about Lincoln's approach to preserving the Union." The title still felt wonderfully new to Sarah's ears. Mrs. Crawford. She had been Sarah Catherine Crawford for 4 months now, but the joy of belonging to this extraordinary family had not diminished with familiarity. Their wedding had been the social event of Millbrook's brief history. Dr. Hartwell had returned from Denver to serve as matron of honor, bringing with her a delegation from the Territorial Women's Rights Committee who proclaimed Sarah's marriage a victory for progressive thinking about family structures. Attorney Foster had given away the bride in lieu of family from Philadelphia, who had maintained their cold disapproval of Sarah's choices despite her obvious happiness. But it was the children who had made the wedding truly memorable. Daniel had served as James's best man with the serious dignity befitting his role as eldest son. Mary and Emma had been bridesmaids, wearing matching dresses of pale blue that complemented their natural coloring. Joseph had carried the rings with solemn concentration, while little Ruth had scattered flower petals with enthusiastic abandon that had made the entire congregation laugh with delight. The ceremony itself had been conducted by Reverend Matthews, who had spoken eloquently about the different forms that love and family could take, using James and Sarah's union as an example of how God's plan often exceeded human expectations and conventions. Sometimes, Reverend Matthews had proclaimed, the Lord brings people together not through the paths they plan to walk, but through the detours that teach them what they truly need. James and Sarah have found in each other not just romantic love, but a shared calling to create family through devotion rather than blood, and to serve their community through education and moral leadership. Now, as Sarah watched her mixed group of biological Crawford children and neighbor students begin their morning lessons, she reflected on how perfectly the Reverend's words had proven true. "Mama Sarah," Ruth called from the garden where she was helping Emma collect the last of the autumn vegetables, "look how big the pumpkins got." The title Mama Sarah had emerged naturally from the children without any adult prompting or discussion. Even Daniel, who at 16 could hardly be expected to call anyone Mama, had begun referring to her as "my stepmother Sarah," with obvious pride in their relationship. James emerged from the barn, where he had been checking on a mare expected to foal soon, his face showing the contentment of a man whose life had exceeded his greatest hopes. "How are our scholars progressing today?" he asked, wrapping his arms around Sarah from behind as they watched the children working through arithmetic problems on individual slate boards. "Remarkably well. Daniel is ready for advanced mathematics that I'll need to order from Denver, and Mary has discovered a passion for literature that rivals my own love of books. Even little Emma is reading at a level that would impress educators back in Philadelphia. And their teacher is becoming famous throughout the territory for her innovative methods," James said proudly. "I received another letter yesterday from the Education Authority in Colorado Springs, asking if you'd be willing to train other frontier teachers in your techniques." Sarah leaned back against James's solid warmth, marveling at how completely her definition of success and fulfillment had changed since arriving in Colorado. Instead of the limited domestic role she had expected as Thomas Mitchell's wife, if he had accepted her, she had found a calling that utilized her education and natural teaching abilities while allowing her to mother children who desperately needed guidance and love. "James, sometimes I can barely believe this is real. 6 months ago, I was sitting in a hotel room convinced that my life was essentially over. Now I have more purpose and joy than I ever imagined possible. Sarah, you've given us far more than we've given you. Before you came, we were a collection of individuals who cared about each other, but lacked the cohesion that makes a family truly strong. You brought that missing element, not just maternal love, but intellectual stimulation and educational ambition that has transformed all of us. It was true. Under Sarah's influence, the ranch had become a center of learning and cultural activity that attracted visitors from across the territory. Traveling lecturers stopped to speak with the children about science and literature. Military officers shared their knowledge of geography and current events. Even traders and businessmen found themselves drawn into discussions about economics and social progress. "Pa James, Mama Sarah," Billy called excitedly from the pasture where he had been checking fence lines. "Come quick! Lightning had her foal, and it's the most beautiful thing you ever saw." The family rushed to the pasture where Lightning, James's prized mare, stood protectively over a gangly-legged colt with markings that promised he would be spectacular when mature. The children gathered around the fence, chattering with excitement about names and training plans, while James examined the newborn with the expert eye of an experienced rancher. "He's perfect," James announced with satisfaction. "Strong, healthy, and if those markings are any indication, he'll be one of the finest horses in Colorado when he's grown." "What should we name him?" Emma asked, bouncing with enthusiasm. "I think that should be Mama Sarah's decision," Daniel said thoughtfully. "She's the newest member of our family, so she should have the honor of naming our newest animal family member." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at Daniel's gesture of inclusion and respect. These children, who had accepted her so completely from their first meeting, continued to find ways to demonstrate that she belonged with them absolutely and permanently. "What about Phoenix?" Sarah suggested, studying the colt's golden coat with white markings that resembled flames. "He represents new beginnings and hope rising from difficult circumstances." "Phoenix," James repeated approvingly, "perfect for a colt born into a family that understands the value of second chances and new beginnings." As they walked back toward the house for the midday meal, Sarah reflected on the profound changes that had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. The Crawford children were thriving academically and emotionally in ways that impressed every adult who encountered them. James had found in their marriage not just romantic fulfillment, but a true partnership that enhanced both their individual strengths and their shared commitment to family and community service. Even the broader community had benefited from their union. The school Sarah had established was producing the most educated children in the region. The ranch had become a model of progressive thinking about family structures and social responsibility. Their marriage had proven that love and commitment could create stronger families than biological connection alone. "Sarah," James said as they gathered around the dinner table with all 6 children, "I've been thinking about something Dr. Hartwell mentioned in her last letter." "What's that?" "She suggested that we consider taking in more children, not just orphans, but children from families struggling with economic hardship who could benefit from educational opportunities and stable home environments." Sarah felt her heart skip with excitement at the possibility. "James, do you mean it? Would we have room and resources for more children? With the income from your teaching position and the success of our cattle operation, we're in better financial condition than most families in Colorado. More importantly, we've proven that love multiplies rather than divides when it's shared among more people." Daniel looked up from his plate with the serious expression that characterized his approach to family decisions. "Pa James, Mama Sarah, I think it's a wonderful idea. We have so much here. Why shouldn't we share it with children who need what we can provide?" Mary nodded enthusiastic agreement. And think how much more interesting our school would become with more students from different backgrounds and experiences. Even the younger children chimed in with support for expanding their family, demonstrating the security and confidence that came from knowing they were unconditionally loved and permanently valued. Then it's settled, James said with a smile that transformed his weathered face. We'll contact Dr. Hartwell about children who might benefit from joining our family. As Sarah looked around the dinner table at the faces of her husband and children who had become hers through love rather than biology, but were hers absolutely and permanently nonetheless, she realized that Thomas Mitchell's cruel rejection had been the greatest gift he could have unknowingly given her. She had come to Colorado seeking conventional marriage and traditional family life, only to discover something far more precious. A calling that utilized her unique gifts, a love that valued her for exactly who she was, and a family that had been created through choice, commitment, and the radical idea that biological connection was less important than emotional devotion. "Thank you," she whispered, speaking to James, but meaning something larger. Gratitude for the journey that had brought her from despair to joy, from rejection to acceptance, from believing she was fundamentally flawed to understanding that she was exactly who she was meant to be. In the Colorado mountains, surrounded by the family she had never expected but always needed, Sarah Catherine Crawford had found her true calling, not as a woman defined by what she couldn't do, but as a mother, teacher, and partner whose worth was measured by the love she gave and the lives she touched. And in the years that followed, as their family grew to include more children who needed homes, and their school expanded to serve an ever-widening community, Sarah would never forget the profound truth she had learned. Sometimes the most beautiful destinations are the ones we never planned to reach, and the greatest love stories begin not with perfection, but with the courage to believe that we are worthy of love exactly as we are. 5 years had passed since Sarah Catherine Walsh first stepped off the train in Millbrook, Colorado, her heart heavy with hope and terror in equal measure. Now, as she stood in the parlor of the expanded Crawford Ranch house, adjusting her best silk dress and checking her reflection in the large mirror James had imported from Denver, she could barely recognize the desperate woman who had once sat, abandoned on a train platform with $12 and a broken dream. Today marked not just her 5th wedding anniversary, but the grand opening of the Crawford Institute for Frontier Education, a formal school and teacher training facility that had grown from humble beginnings in a converted barn to become the most respected educational institution between Denver and Colorado Springs. The territorial governor himself would be attending, along with educators, politicians, and families from across 3 counties who had come to celebrate what the Denver Post had called a remarkable experiment in progressive education and family formation. Mama Sarah called 16-year-old Margaret, one of the 4 additional children who had joined their family over the past 3 years. "The carriages are starting to arrive, and Daniel says you should come see how beautiful the ceremony setup looks." Sarah smiled at Margaret's excitement. The girl had arrived at their ranch 2 years ago, a frightened 13-year-old whose parents had died in a typhoid epidemic, leaving her to care for 3 younger siblings while living in conditions that barely qualified as shelter. Now she was thriving academically, had grown into a confident young woman, and served as Sarah's assistant in managing the increasingly complex household that had grown to include 12 children, ranging from toddler to young adult. "Tell Daniel, I'll be right there, dear. Is everyone dressed and ready for our guests?" "Yes, ma'am." Even little Thomas managed to keep his good clothes clean for a whole hour, which Mary says might be a record. Thomas was the newest addition to their family, a 3-year-old whose mother had died in childbirth and whose father, overwhelmed by grief and the demands of frontier mining work, had gratefully accepted James and Sarah's offer to provide the boy with a stable home and loving family. Like all the Crawford children, Thomas had blossomed under the combination of structured guidance and unconditional love that defined their household. Sarah made her way through the house that had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family and the steady stream of visitors who came to observe their educational methods or seek advice about establishing similar programs in their own communities. The original log structure had been enhanced with additional wings that provided private rooms for each child, guest accommodations for visiting educators, and specialized spaces for different types of instruction and study. The parlor where Sarah had been preparing showcased the success and prosperity that had come with their unconventional approach to family and education. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on every subject from classical literature to advanced mathematics to practical sciences. A piano occupied one corner, where the children gathered each evening for music lessons that had become legendary throughout the territory for their quality and sophistication. But it was the photographs, covering one entire wall, that told the real story of the Crawford family's evolution. Images showed the original 6 children on Sarah's first day at the ranch, formal portraits from their wedding, candid shots of various children arriving to join the family, and recent photographs of academic achievements, community events, and the daily life of what had become Colorado's most famous unconventional household. "Sarah," James called from the front porch, his voice carrying the warm satisfaction of a man whose life had exceeded his most ambitious dreams. "You need to see this crowd. I think half of Colorado has come to celebrate with us today." Sarah joined her husband on the wide front porch, taking his offered arm as they surveyed the scene before them. The ranch's main yard had been transformed into an outdoor reception area, with long tables laden with food contributed by neighboring families, a speaker's platform decorated with autumn flowers and territorial flags, and seating arrangements that could accommodate the hundreds of guests who had traveled from across the region to attend this celebration. Children ran between the assembled adults, playing games that crossed family lines and demonstrated the inclusive community atmosphere that had developed around the Crawford Ranch. Sarah recognized dozens of her former students, now young adults themselves, who had returned to honor the teacher who had shaped their early education and inspired their continued learning. "James, look at what we've built together," Sarah said, unconsciously echoing the words she had spoken on their wedding day 5 years ago. "Not just our family, but this entire community of learning and support." "What you've built, more accurately," James replied, his grey eyes warm with the deep affection that had only grown stronger over the years of their marriage. "I provided the ranch and the children, but you created the vision and the methods that transformed individual need into a collective purpose." It was true, though Sarah had never thought of her work in such grand terms. What had begun as simple lessons for the Crawford children had evolved organically into a comprehensive educational philosophy that emphasized individual potential over standardized expectations, collaborative learning over competitive grading, and practical application over rote memorization. The success of her methods had attracted attention from educational reformers throughout the American West, leading to invitations to speak at conferences, requests to train other teachers, and ultimately the territorial government's decision to establish the Crawford Institute as an official teacher training facility, with Sarah as its first director. "Ladies and gentlemen," called Dr. Eleanor Hartwell from the speaker's platform, her voice carrying the authority that had made her one of the most respected advocates for women's rights and educational reform in the Western Territories. "If you would please take your seats, we're ready to begin this afternoon's dedication ceremony." The crowd settled into the arranged seating, with the controlled excitement of people attending a significant historical event. Sarah could see faces from every stage of her Colorado journey. Townspeople from Millbrook, who had supported her during the dark days of Thomas Mitchell's persecution. Territorial officials, who had initially doubted her methods, but had become converted advocates. Neighboring ranchers whose children had benefited from her teaching, and the ever-growing network of educators who had traveled from distant communities. To learn from her example, Governor Samuel Crawford, no relation to her husband despite the shared surname, rose to address the gathering with the formal dignity appropriate to such an occasion. "Friends and fellow Coloradans," the governor began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "we gather today to celebrate not just the establishment of a new educational institution, but the remarkable story of how one woman's personal struggles became the foundation for revolutionary changes in how we approach teaching and family formation throughout our territory." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks at being the center of such public attention, but James's supportive presence beside her helped her maintain the composure expected of the occasion. 5 years ago, Governor Crawford continued, Sarah Catherine Walsh arrived in Colorado seeking conventional marriage and traditional domestic life. Instead, she found something far more significant, a calling that has transformed not just her own circumstances, but the educational opportunities available to children throughout the Western Territories. The governor went on to detail the measurable impacts of Sarah's work. Literacy rates in their region had increased by over 300%. Children from Crawford Institute families were gaining admission to colleges and universities at unprecedented rates, and her teacher training programs had established similar schools throughout Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah territories. But statistics, impressive as they are, cannot capture the real significance of what Sarah Crawford has accomplished here, the governor said, his tone growing more personal. She has proven that the most valuable education comes not from rigid adherence to established curricula, but from recognizing and nurturing the unique potential that exists in every child, regardless of their background or circumstances. When called upon to speak, Sarah rose with the confidence that had developed over years of addressing audiences, ranging from territorial legislators to international education conferences. Her transformation from the desperate woman who had once faced Thomas Mitchell's cruel rejection to this poised professional educator still amazed her, but it no longer surprised her. Governor Crawford, Dr. Hartwell, distinguished guests, and most importantly, my beloved family and students, Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. Today we celebrate not just the establishment of an institution, but the power of second chances and the courage to believe that our greatest disappointments can become our most meaningful opportunities. She paused, looking out at the faces before her, some familiar, some strange, all representing communities and families whose lives had been touched by the educational philosophy that had grown from her own experience of being judged and found, wanting by conventional standards. 5 years ago, I was rejected for marriage because I could not bear biological children. Today, I am the mother of 12 children who have taught me that family is created through love and commitment rather than blood and biology. I was dismissed as unsuitable for frontier life because of my Eastern education and delicate constitution. Today, I stand before you as proof that intellectual curiosity and educational innovation are exactly what frontier communities need to thrive and grow. The applause that greeted her words was warm and sustained, but Sarah had more to say about the deeper meanings of their celebration. The Crawford Institute for Frontier Education exists not just to train teachers or educate children, but to demonstrate that every individual, regardless of age, background, or perceived limitations, possesses unique gifts that can benefit their entire community when properly recognized and nurtured. She turned to gesture toward James and their assembled children, who were watching her with the pride and affection that had become the foundation of her identity and confidence. My husband, James Crawford, understood this principle when he chose to create family through adoption rather than wait for biological connection. Our children have demonstrated it by excelling academically and personally, despite the challenges of their early lives. Our community has embraced it by supporting educational methods that honor individual differences rather than demanding conformity to narrow standards. As Sarah continued her address, she wove together the personal and political threads of her story, how individual struggles with rejection and limitation had led to broader insights about human potential and social progress. She spoke about the importance of creating educational environments where children felt valued for their unique contributions rather than judged by standardized expectations. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah concluded, we celebrate today the truth that our greatest failures and disappointments often contain the seeds of our most meaningful successes. The rejection that brought me to Colorado led me to find not just personal happiness, but professional purpose that has allowed me to contribute to my community in ways I never could have imagined in my former life. The standing ovation that followed her speech seemed to continue indefinitely, with guests rising to their feet not just to applaud her words, but to demonstrate their appreciation for the concrete improvements her work had brought to their own families and communities. As the formal ceremonies concluded and the celebration moved into the social phase of dining, dancing, and community conversation, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers and admirers who wanted to share their own stories of how her educational methods or family example had influenced their lives. Former students, now adults with families of their own, described how her teaching had prepared them for college studies or professional careers that would have been impossible without the foundation she had provided. Parents credited her with helping their children discover academic interests and abilities that had transformed their expectations for their futures. Most moving were the stories from other women who had faced rejection or limitation based on biological circumstances, and who had found in Sarah's example the courage to build meaningful lives despite society's narrow definitions of female worth and purpose. Mrs. Crawford said a young woman who had traveled from Wyoming Territory specifically to attend the celebration, "I wanted to thank you for showing women like me that we can create families and find purpose, even when traditional paths are closed to us. Your story gave me the courage to establish a school for orphaned children in my community, and it's become the most rewarding work of my life." As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Sarah found herself standing once again on the front porch with James, watching their extended family of children, neighbors, and friends continue the festivities that had transformed their ranch into a community celebration. "Sarah," James said, pulling her close as they observed the scene before them, "do you ever regret the path that brought you here? Do you ever wonder what your life might have been like if Thomas Mitchell had accepted you, or if you had never left Philadelphia?" Sarah considered the question seriously, as she always did when James asked her to reflect on the deeper meanings of their shared journey. "James, I think about alternate possibilities sometimes, but I can't imagine any other path that would have led to greater happiness or more meaningful work. Thomas Mitchell's rejection was the best thing that ever happened to me, though I certainly couldn't see it that way at the time." She gestured toward the scene before them, children playing games that crossed family and social boundaries, adults engaged in conversations about education and community improvement, teenagers discussing their plans for college and careers that reflected ambitions their parents could never have imagined. "Look what we've built together, not just for ourselves, but for this entire community. None of this would exist if I had settled for conventional marriage and traditional limitations. My inability to bear biological children led me to mother dozens of children who needed love and guidance. My rejection by one narrow-minded man led me to find a partnership based on shared values and mutual respect rather than economic convenience. James nodded, his weathered face showing the deep satisfaction of a man whose life had exceeded his most ambitious hopes. And my experience of loss and unconventional family formation prepared me to recognize your worth when others couldn't see past their own prejudices, he added. We were both shaped by disappointments that taught us to value what really matters, in family and partnership. As the stars began to appear in the vast Colorado sky and the last of their guests prepared to depart, Sarah reflected on the profound truth that had become the foundation of both her personal happiness and professional philosophy, that human worth could not be measured by conventional standards, that the most meaningful families were often those created through choice rather than chance, and that the greatest contributions to community welfare came from individuals who had been forced to discover their own unique strengths rather than rely on traditional advantages. The mail-order bride, who had been rejected for being barren, had become the mother of 12 children and the teacher of hundreds more. The woman dismissed as unsuitable for frontier life had created one of the territory's most successful educational institutions. The individual judged as fundamentally flawed had discovered that her differences were actually her greatest strengths. And in the quiet moments of this perfect evening, surrounded by the family she had never expected but always needed, Sarah Catherine Crawford understood that sometimes the most beautiful destinations are indeed the ones we never planned to reach. And the greatest love stories begin not with perfection, but with the courage to believe that we are worthy of love and success exactly as we are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.